7 is pleased to present Austin Faith Dialogue, brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries. In the weeks ahead, you will see these and other programs by various denominations. Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interaction between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTVC. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
He has been called the stabilizer, a consummate colleague, and a beloved professor. I know him as professor, mentor, and friend. Prescott Williams, Jr., Professor Emeritus at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, has been an international voice in the study and love of the Hebrew Scriptures, known to most Christians as the Old Testament. Hello, I'm Valerie Bridgman Davis, Outreach Pastor of Sure Foundation Fellowship, and your host for today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Today, I will talk with Professor Williams, who has retired from his post as Old Testament and archaeology professor at Austin Seminary. In addition to professor, in his 31 years of service to the school, Professor Williams also served at different times as dean and president. Welcome to you today, Professor Williams. I'm glad to have you here.
Thank you, Valerie.
It's good to talk to you. Now, I want to talk to you about a lot of things, and I don't know that we're going to get it done in 30 minutes. But I want to start with, you spent 31 years at the school. And in that time, as you retired, there was a book written on you in celebrating your retirement. And one of the quotes that I took out of the book says, "Some people are called to write books. I am called to read them." You have been pegged as saying that. Would you tell us what that means?
Well, it's a partly defensive statement because professors are expected to write. I've never found writing enjoyable, except writing letters, which I did hundreds of as president of the seminary. And I was trying to say that I understand my vocation as professor not to be primarily directed at writing, but primarily directed at working with current students and teaching students whom I know and can interact with, rather than putting words on paper and letting it be read by people I don't know. I find it difficult to communicate in ways satisfactory to myself when I don't know to whom I am speaking or writing.
What made you decide you were not a writer? I mean,
the pain of writing and the criticism of people who read my writing. They never said very kind things about it, and I couldn't understand why it was not good. But I found writing sermons when I was a pastor because I could envision the people and had interacted with them and worked with them on committees, been in their homes, been to the hospital, and that I could envision them as I wrote, and that made everything different for me, and I could make it flow the way I wanted it to go. Although my wife said she used to get 3 sermons a week out of me, the one I wrote, the one we talked about after she had read it on Saturday afternoon, and then the one I preached in the live setting of worship on Sunday, when I was looking into the eyes of people and watching their reactions.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a seminary where they taught us to preach without notes, to have what we were going to say so in our own possession that we could relate to the audience and keep eye contact, watch reactions, see puzzlement, see and hear what was going on, and not just be focused on a piece of paper.
Mm-hmm.
I have trouble lecturing for the same reason, because I know what I want to say, but I don't want to read it, because I want to look into the eyes, and I want to see when somebody frowns and wonders, what in the world is that? Because I think my sense of achievement is, as I think back on the years of teaching, is primarily the achievement of helping people learn who somewhere along in their lives had been told they couldn't, and were in seminary anyway because they wanted to be ministers, and that I accepted the challenge and gained great satisfaction out of seeing people learn and be excited about it. But there's something about my visual orientation that requires people.
Well, the truth is, you were telling me, and I just learned this about you. I've known you 3 years, but you were telling me you were a poor student in high school.
Oh my, terrible. Both our city, Detroit, Michigan, in the years I was in high school, my family, and our high school were disrupted places. The original race riots in Detroit, and I think therefore in America, originated on the campus of our high school. And I had friends beaten up and knifed and all of that. And the last year I was in high school, we had to be searched, body searched, going into the school, and we had to have police protection, and we were not allowed to stand around and visit on the campus because of all the disturbing events that were taking place. And I guess because I guess I was disturbed by that, and that and other features of my life, so that I ended up taking American history 3 times in high school. I flunked it once, I passed it the second time, and then to get my grade average up, because I was beginning to think about going to college for reasons I still don't understand, I took it again after graduation to get a grade that would raise my average.
So we'll get you into college?
Hopefully.
And you did go to college. You went to Wheaton College.
In Illinois.
Which is...
not the girls' school in Massachusetts.
Okay. You went to Wheaton.
That's right.
And it's a conservative school.
Baptist predominantly.
Which is very different than the Presbyterian that you grew up.
All right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
I was the first male in the Williams clan, to which I belong, to go to college. We didn't know anything about going to college. And it happened that a couple of people from my church had gone to Wheaton College recently, and I knew them both, and one of them I had known quite well, and she encouraged me to go there. So after high school and working a year and a half in department store and then in a factory, I had enough money to start college, and I went in February of 1943 and have been out of school only 1 full year since that time.
What did you do in that 1 full year?
I was a pastor, my first pastorate, and somewhere along the line someone had said that after your first year in the pastorate, you ought to read all your sermons and lessons and things and see what you're doing. And I started into that. I didn't get through it because I found it not a very pleasant experience, and it was disrupting. But I discovered that I was not preaching from the whole Bible, but only from the New Testament. And I said, I wonder why? Because I had studied Old Testament from 1943 on. I began the pastorate in the fall of 1950, just after we were married. And it was because I was a Greek minor in college and had a great high level of confidence in my work with the Greek New Testament, but I did not feel competent in Hebrew. I didn't have the ease to work with the original languages of the Old Testament, Hebrew and Aramaic. So I looked around for some place to do something about that and started commuting one day a week with the permission of my church officers, 130 miles each way, including a ferry trip across the Chesapeake Bay to go to Baltimore just for 2 hours of class to read Hebrew with Dr. William F. Albright, a pioneer linguist and archaeologist in this country. And I kept doing that for a number of years until some friends of mine said they wanted to see me finish the degree and become a teacher, and they put together some funding that allowed me not to work full-time for a while and to finish my program, so that what I started in the fall of '51, 2 days before I became a father, finished on Flag Day of 1960.
Now, what some of your students may not know about you is that your first time in the Hebrew scriptures,
yes,
you failed Hebrew.
I have failed the test. I did, and it made me so mad that I decided I was just going to prove that that wasn't correct. I'd had the same experience in my first course in college, which was the second semester of zoology, and everybody else in the course had been in the first semester. And on the first test, I really bombed it. And so I went back and studied the book and found out the professor was only asking questions about things that were in italics in the book, so all I studied from then on was the italics. But in Hebrew, I couldn't get away with that. I had to just buckle down and work on it, and been at it ever since. That was fall of 1948.
Well, I've had the privilege of working with you, tutoring students, also learning from you Hebrew, and I watch you with students, and that's why I thought it would be interesting to tell your students that you didn't pass that first test, because I watch you with students who fail the first test and think they're never going to learn Hebrew. You said something to me that learning, memory, is interest. Would you talk about that a little bit?
I am convinced, I'm not a theoretician about memory, but I have been in education a long time and have taught languages, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and I have taught English to foreign people. And I am convinced that the key to memory, without which very little learning can take place, is interest. That you have to want, for some reason, to learn and to remember, either because it's a person whom you like, and you say, well, or the person's powerful, and you say, well, in the future, this person can help me. And so in interest, self-interest and general interest, and then memory works by association. But I don't think it works without interest. And so therefore, as you know, in the Hebrew course, I will tell students, I know that some of you are not interested.
That's right.
Now, this is a 1-month intensive course. I want you to fake interest, and pretty soon you'll find that it's going to work, because I think everyone has an excellent memory. I think it depends on what they're interested in remembering. I have a dear friend, probably the dearest friend in the world, who cannot remember people's names, although she is very people-oriented. But you ask her about the style of this furniture or any piece of furniture, and she will tell you more than you ever wanted to know about that furniture. It's not an effort, it's interest.
Yes. Well, in 31 years of teaching, being president, being dean, I'm sure you have a lot of student stories. Do you have a favorite?
Well, I have a lot of favorite...
No names.
No, I have a lot of favorite students. I remember one time that one of our alumni had come back for a meeting, and he and I were standing outside the dining hall, and one of the current students waited for a break in our conversation and said, Prescott, and as you know, they call me by my first name, and when I was asked about what did I know that and what did I think about it, I said, well, when you consider the alternatives, it's not bad. But he said, Prescott, can I ask you a stupid question? And before I could answer, this alumni, who by that time had earned his own doctorate in Old Testament studies, said, Prescott has never heard a stupid question. Because I've always believed that what people think is a stupid question is probably the most important question in the room. And somebody needs to ask it because most people are too inhibited to ask it. It probably questions the fundamental reality behind what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But people call those stupid questions. I don't. And, you know, but I suppose if someone asked me what student stories I would like to tell, it would be a great many of them about what I have learned from my students.
Mm-hmm.
What I have helped them to discover that then they have taught me. And I think that's one of the greatest rewards of teaching.
Yeah. You've been studying Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, since 1944.
Right.
That's when you first got interested.
Right.
I would imagine there have been a lot of changes in the field
yes.
in that time. Can you talk a little bit about the changes in the study of, the perceptions of Scripture,
Okay.
Hebrew Scripture?
Yeah. Not necessarily 1944, but in this century,
Yes.
we have come to learn the languages of the Bible with greater precision because of archaeological recovery of documents in those languages, scrolls, tablets, and in related languages that enable us to understand these languages in their context, their cultural and historical context, in such a way that we can understand Hebrew better than St. Paul could possibly have understood it, because we have more direct access to it. And so we are now in a position, through the use of comparative Semitic studies with languages that weren't even known before 1900, like Ugaritic, Eblaite, which just became known in 1975, which are related to Hebrew, that enable us to recognize in Hebrew, for instance, words which people thought were wrong, but are actually borrowed words from other languages, or very old words spelled strangely because they're old fossilized words. So the comparative study of cultures, languages, and histories that has been implemented in large part by archaeological discoveries, which then have been subjected to all kinds of investigation, has really revolutionized our knowledge. And therefore, in my generation, there have been more translations of the Bible into more languages in the world than ever before in history, necessitated not only by those languages and their changes, but by our new knowledge of biblical languages, biblical customs, and biblical civilizations, and including ones we didn't know about.
Would you talk with us a little while, Professor Williams, about the way Scripture is used both by the Academy and the Church, and how, well, I see Scripture sometimes not as a unifying force, but as a dividing force.
Yes.
So would you talk a little bit about how Scripture is used by the Academy and by the Church?
Well, the part of the Academy I belong to has been largely in the service of the Church. Sometimes that service is criticism, which is a very important service for all of us, especially if it's done by people we respect. But I think what I find is the greatest problem with respect to Scripture is that there are people who believe and who teach people to believe that you can read and understand Scripture without interpreting it. And that this interpretation, often that they encourage, telescopes the distance in time, the distance in culture, the distance in language between us and the times of the Bible and people of the Bible in such a way as to make things equal each other, irrespective of the fact that that's thousands of years we're talking about and thousands of miles apart and different languages. And so the task that I have been most dedicated to is interpreting Scripture in its own context. For instance, we have controversy that still goes on about creation and science. And I think people on both sides oversimplify the issue and at the same time complicate it. The first chapter of Genesis, in my opinion, was a missionary document addressed to Babylonian non-believers and to exiles from Israel living in Babylon who were attracted to the Babylonian understanding of life, and that it is not primarily a document that just set out to say how did the world begin, but it set out to say who began the world and how do humans figure in that. And, you know, we have creation stories from Babylon, and people say, well, we have these kinds of stories, but they are different. In the oldest Babylonian story we have, humans are made, first of all, to relieve the lesser gods from the arduous labor of digging the irrigation canals for Babylonian agriculture. The human is made of the blood of a dead, guilty god who had rebelled against the high gods, and mud. And for the purpose of relieving the gods from their obligations. Now, does that sound like Genesis?
No.
No. Genesis says God created humans in God's own image, and then didn't just tell them what to do, but blessed them, which means enable them to do the task for which they were shaped and destined. And I think what's being presented there to people in Babylonian culture is an alternate understanding of self, God, and role in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that to spend all our time arguing about whether it's scientific is to miss the point. It was scientific at the time, but the science it reflects was Babylonian science.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, as a friend of mine who writes in this book that you showed, says Genesis 1 has in it the greatest understatement in all of literature. And he made the stars also. Now, that's important because the stars were divinized in Babylonian culture,
yes,
and people studied them to understand the shape and the future of their lives. They worshiped them. They worshiped the sun and the moon. And in Genesis, these are reduced to God's servants on behalf of the world and people.
Right.
So it's the historical setting, the original purpose of the writers in making the testimony they make, and plus the fact that they choose the way to do it, whether it's in a creedal form, a poetic form, a victory song, or a story, various kinds of stories, including all those bad stories,
yes,
which tell us again and again how bad the world can be,
mm-hmm,
and without God's work through people in the world would constantly be.
Let's turn the corner.
All right.
I can't imagine that you're going to really retire. I can't imagine that. So what are you going to do in your next life?
My next life? Well, I'm going to shift gears, and I've given myself the next 6 months to sift out my interests, and one of them is to write a book on the Babylonian setting of the middle portion of the book of Isaiah, with a reconstruction and interpretation of Babylonian life and its dynamics based primarily on popular public art, because most people were illiterate at the time and did not read the literature, but they did see the art, mm-hmm, which was in public currency. And I'm going to fish, make up for several years of not fishing much. I'm going to paint again, pictures.
Paint pictures?
Yes, Joan Salvant, local artist, is my art teacher.
Oh.
And wife of one of my former students. And I'm going to spend time with my grandchildren, my wife, who has recovered from a coronary and is in good health, and we're going to travel, including taking a trip which the trustees of the seminary gave us at my retirement, which is round trip tickets to Australia.
Oh, going down under.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You said something earlier about cleaning out your garage. Are you nigging on that?
No, I'm going to clean out the garage, but I'm not going to do it all at once. But a friend of mine, a widow of one of my former colleagues, said to me when I said that to somebody, she said, Prescott, you're going to find that it's easier, even easier, to find reasons not to do the things you don't want to do when you retire as it was before.
In addition to retiring to clean out the garage, you're also very busy in the local congregation.
Yes, Trinity Presbyterian
Church.
Yes, I teach a lot in Trinity Church, and my wife's an elder there. And I also do a lot of teaching in local churches and in the region. I'll be teaching an introduction to the Old Testament for laity for seminary credit in Midland, Texas, the end of July, beginning of August.
Let me give you a chance to give a plug to your grandkids. Because I was your student for 3 years. I can't remember you not talking about your grandkids.
To me, I once said after having our first grandchildren that having grandchildren makes having children almost worthwhile. But the main thing I'd say about it is that you have the chance, if you relate to them and listen to them and I'm going to spend this Saturday with 4 of them. The 5th one's visiting her other grandmother, and the 6th one's not due till July. But the 4 of them and I are going to be together most of the day doing different kinds of things. And I will get a whole new view of the world through their various eyes and questions and experiences. And I think it is a way of almost starting over again to look at the world again and yourself and other people through them. I think there's something about being free to do it in a way you might not have been free when your own children were that age.
Why do you think that's true?
Well, I think it's true because the world has changed so much, and most workplaces are distant from the home, and so you have this separation of children from one or both parents for a large part of the day. When I first saw my mother-in-law's home place in Ireland, I realized that for over 6 generations, those children were never more than 20 feet away from both parents all day long, the house and the blacksmith shop across. And yet fathers are largely out of it today.
That's true. Well, our time is just about running out, and I want to read another quote, some phrases that were said about you. Paul C. Warren and also William Albright said something like this about you. You have one of the clearest minds that they had ever seen, excellent memory, an analytical mind, and you like leading people to think. And I would like to say that that's a pretty accurate description of the Prescott Williams I know. As we come to an end of today's discussion, I want to thank you, Prescott, for being with us and for sharing your insights and your life with us. Join us again next week for another edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. Until next time, peace to you.
And peace to you.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472-7627.